we're going to start introductions quickly. I'm April Dunham.
Margay Diamond.
Brian Core.
Gail Harbour. Lauren Wilcox.
Jim Byers.
Lynn Mazza.
Marsh Hudson Knapp.
Sarah Beth Ward.
And Stuart Curtis.
Okay, great. So our last meeting, hopefully everyone had a chance to look over the meetings, minutes. We did have some responses from Brian with some outstanding questions. We went over the scope, powers, and duties. We didn't get to the complaint process, but Stu did ask some questions about whether it's needed. We did add some things to the other documents that address partial complaint process things. So one of our objectives tonight is to discuss if we want to have a formal complaint process outside of the other document, as well as we are supposed to come up with some names for the board and then review the final document when we're piecing together all the final documents into one final document. Okay? And do I have any changes to the meeting minutes from last meeting? Okay, can I have a vote to accept the meeting minutes?
So moved.
Okay, great.
Aye.
Thank you.
Lynn.
Okay.
Lynn gets special
Should I-
stars in her crown. She's amazing.
Sprinkles.
She is. Okay, so we're going to move to the first item, which is the timeline. Stu did print these out for us. Some thoughts on what we want the timeline to look like as we
So
move forward.
this came from the select board to April and I, and it isn't really different from what we were given at the beginning when we joined the task force, right? So I don't think there's any shockers in here. One of the things that my subcommittee with Marsh and Lynn, when we were looking at piecing the whole document together, is we did think that we are probably going to be in need of setting some time for whoever wants to do the presentation to come together and sort of figure out what's the best way to present the material, right? So whether that's a subcommittee, sounds like maybe we could do a subcommittee, whoever is interested in actually making the presentation to the select board. You know, you're not just going to put the document down, right? Like there's some presentation format that we're going to follow, and so that needs to be addressed in here. And we don't really have time outside of approving the documents and all of that to do that. So I sort of think it's a subcommittee that splits off and works on the presentation part of things. Does that make sense, or do people feel like we want to come together as a group?
I would need to recuse myself from that because I actually film the meetings for CAT TV, the select board meeting. So I couldn't be part of that.
Okay.
So are you suggesting that we have a subcommittee that gets together, they put together the presentation, and then the day of, they'll more or less present it?
I guess that's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
3 or 4 people want to break off and say, we want to be responsible and lead the charge for the actual presentation. And then putting that together. I mean, I assume everyone would want to come to the actual presentation, right? But we can't all do it, so I'm certainly open to ideas. That's just, that was one thought, is that we break off 3 or 4 people to address that piece.
I think I'm a little thick and I'm having a hard time hearing you through the mask. Let me see if I understand what I think you're saying, is that we stick with this proposed timeline and that we take time after this meeting to prepare a presentation, and then we meet, even though it's not on here, to review that presentation and make sure it's up to muster.
That's a good idea.
There was not a suggestion of a second whole group meeting. It was just suggested that this subcommittee would put it. But I would not be opposed to another whole group meeting just to like look it over and give it an okay.
Yeah. Dry run, certainly a good idea.
Yeah, it might be a good time to roll it out too.
So 2 pieces. One is, do people agree that we get some volunteers, 3 or 4 people who want to work on the actual presentation? Does that sound okay to people?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. So, and would you like another meeting to stick in here? So we don't muck up the timeline, we'd find a date and we'd all come together, and those 3 or 4 people, the subcommittee, would present, and then we get some feedback and I'll be ready to go in as a cohesive group.
And we wouldn't have to have a long meeting, we could do
No.
an hour meeting to see the presentation and get into it, I would think.
I don't think that's necessary, but I'm not opposed to it.
Okay, we can offer it up then. I don't know, yeah,
I guess my question is, would you be able to fit in a second group meeting and still meet the January 31st report sent to chair, vice chair of select board?
yeah, because the presentation to the select board is February 21st, right? So getting our documents done today and approved is checking the box for January 31st. After that, we're going to need to think about what the presentation looks like.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Okay. Do we have any takers, since we're on the topic, and then we can close it out and move on? Any takers for who wants to be part of that effort?
I'd be happy to be a part of it, I'd like the presentation. I don't want to be the only one.
I'll do it.
Gonna say, I'd be interested too, but I don't want to rule anybody else out if someone else wants
No.
to.
One more, if we have up to 4, right?
Yep.
All right, right now it's March, Margay, April. Lynn? No? Sarah Beth? All right, think about it. If anybody wants to join that
That
trio.
was making mumbling, and I wasn't sure what that was.
I said he wants to do it, he likes to do it. He likes that stuff.
Okay, great.
I had a question on the timeline. Just, I did notice that February 21st date is President's Day. So I don't know if that's a concern or if that's fine.
Didn't think about that.
Brian, most of our select board meetings fall on the fourth Monday, which tends to be holidays, and we always meet.
Okay.
Okay, so we will have it.
It's only available to you guys.
Well, and my other question was, it was my understanding that select board meetings are second and fourth, which would make it the 14th and the 28th. So this is a
set
separate
up
meeting.
as a special meeting, so this is the only topic
Gotcha.
that we'll have.
That's on the 21st.
Yes.
Great.
Okay.
Does everybody feel okay to move on? Yeah? Okay.
Do we want to pick a time when we're going to meet all together to check the presentation?
Ah,
Or do we want to do that just via email or something, or do we have to do that?
I think the more people you have in the room when you're trying to figure out the date, the easier it is.
So we have to have it before the 21st.
Keep the meeting
So-
on Thursday.
31st is a Friday. So if you look at January 31st, that's a Friday. February 7th is sorry. The 31st, I'm wrong date here, is a Monday. The 7th is a Monday. The 14th is a Monday, and the 21st is, or 28th is a Monday. It skips the 21st.
what about the week of
Is
the,
it-
what about the week of the 7th?
So that gives us about a week and a half to prepare the presentation.
Well, assuming,
I think the timeline is expecting to have the recommendations and report released the week of the 7th.
right,
Yep, so we'll have that, but we're talking about a separate presentation.
just getting together so that we have a nice presentation for the select board.
Whether it's like a
So-
visual slideshow or
Why
something
not
along that
follow
line.
what you've been doing, meet on the first Thursday in February? Which is, I think, the 4th.
The 3rd.
The 3rd.
Is that good, everybody?
Yep.
Great.
That gives you guys,
7.
does that give you guys enough time to put the presentation together?
Because it's like 2 weeks.
I think so. So.
So we're
The
looking
worst
at,
that'll happen is we'll give you a semi-ragtag presentation and have to finish working on it after everybody looks at it. But I think in 2 weeks.
We'll,
we should
we'll have a
already
pretty
be
close
shot
draft, yeah.
so we're looking at February 3rd.
Mhm.
Can we get the room and all that?
We're going to try.
And 4:30.
Yep, 4:30 again, yeah.
Okay.
Great. Clark, sorry?
That date, I'm going to, I guess, need to try to call in again because I will not be back from my travels until evening the 8th of February.
What if we went to the next Thursday and that gave us a little more breathing room and then Clark would be back?
That would be the 10th.
Watching the presentation on the telephone is not going to be really.
Yeah.
So on the 10th instead?
Does that work? That's fine.
Yep.
Oh,
Good.
Clark would bring popcorn.
So that was a pretty easy one. Check. So the next item is the naming convention. So hopefully we all brought a list of names or at least ideas.
I was wondering if maybe Jonah would put names that we brainstormed up on the screen for us so that we could all see them, please.
I didn't get a list in advance, so I'll just type them in as.
Yeah,
Yes, that's
exactly.
And any takers or people that'd like to go first?
Well, I thought of community policing board. I like the idea of board because I think it deserves some authority, and community policing is what we're trying to facilitate, getting the community and the police to be working together as a team. So that's my thought.
I liked Police Citizen Collaborative Board.
I have to say the first two things that I had was Community Policing Advisory Committee and Civilian Police Collaborative Committee. So mine are pretty close to your.
Did you say advisory? What was the?
Advisory Committee.
Got it.
Yeah. I also found another one I thought was kind of an interesting one. It was Community Engaged Policing.
Yes, I like that one.
I was trying to think of things that were collaborative, because I think one of the things that we talked about a lot is we really want this board to be collaborative.
Hey, Bill, can you repeat that last one?
Community Engaged Policing. Anybody, other thoughts?
Bennington Safety and Equity Team, BSET. I like things that sound good.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I like that. I like the acronym.
He said, oh, that's good.
Yeah.
I think the degree of ambiguity of safety, exactly what kind of safety is this board dedicated to?
Well, I think that, the part of our task force definition is, and part of the vision of trying to make police to be something that helps the whole community to be safe together, in contrast to trying to hide behind the bushes and the rest of everybody.
And for law enforcement to be safe.
Yes.
Yes. Improving their access to
Visual safety.
resources is only going to make their job, hopefully, a little bit easier and safer.
Could you repeat that last one? Or was there?
It was just more of a discussion.
It was a discussion.
Yeah.
Safety doesn't appeal to you, Clark.
No, I like the idea of the neutral statement as to their entity. The first few there allude to, in fact, the community and the police working together under the really board's help. But that safety and equity team, in my mind, I'm not saying where there's an engagement and a collaborative effort there. I see it as almost two separate issues, neither of which I think address, in my opinion, address the nature of this organization we're trying to form.
I was thinking about the phrase advisory and review. It's like the Bennington Community Police Advisory Review Board, which sort of describes to me some of the things we've been talking about, how they would advise the board, but also be a review. I'm really opposed to the word oversight. I'm glad that didn't come up, because for me that connotation is supervision and non-professionals supervising professionals doesn't.
So possibly adding Bennington Community Police Advisory Review Board to that line.
The PC power.
There we go.
Right, yeah, that's a little long if you like acronyms.
I thought we weren't supposed to use acronyms.
Anybody that says I'm not supposed to do it, I've got to.
Does it need, could you just say Bennington Community Police Review Board? Because I like advisory as a word, but just to shorten it up, could we?
I think part of what this board is doing is in fact advising not just the police, but the governmental entities and the community at large. So I think it's
Yeah.
important to understand that as part of educating the community, that's an advisory role. That's how I look at it. It's a mistaken, but I would think that.
And as the board acts in review of whatever, policies, procedures, complaints, then the next step would be to advise them. So I think both need to be in there.
If I could suggest, a lot of the town-sanctioned committees and boards, the Bennington is not in it. That's because it's sanctioned by the town, it's sanctioned by the town of Bennington.
Right.
So it's like, it's Development Review Board. Bennington is
Implicit in the name.
correct.
You wouldn't need that.
Yeah.
So Community Police Advisory and Review Board? Basically this, yeah. Should it be advisory and review? Should there be an and in there, or is that just
The
making it too
and
much?
is just a little misplaced. Yeah. Police,
Community Police Advisory and Review Board. Take out the first and. I like that.
I was gonna say, I like that, I think it sums up
Yeah.
everything, and it shows collaboration too.
Yeah, it has both community and police together in it.
And there's an acronym now too, see?
CPAR. It's a lie, whatever.
The CPAR.
Do we have any other thoughts about names?
So I move that we name it the Community Police Advisory and Review Board, the CPAR.
a second.
Great. Do we all have to vote, or can we just make a motion?
I think since that's the title, we should vote.
We should vote, yeah.
So,
So can we have a vote to name this the Community Police Advisory and Review Board, or CPAR? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Any abstained?
Give you abstain, right?
I am abstaining only because that's a long title for me to put in the lower third.
Yeah, I can understand that. Okay, so it sounds like the majority has voted in as the Community Police Advisory and Review Board.
But,
Look at us go. I know, we're doing great today. Okay, so the next item is Complaint Process Subcommittee. Now, part of this was, we were working documents last time, we kind of worked some complaint processes into it, and Stu had wondered if we needed a formal complaint process. So we decided to take time to review the complaint process, the one that we have written up already, and decided that's something that we want to continue with, or if we want to accept it into the other document as it was already written.
so I'm wondering if it would be possible for us to take the whole document that we forwarded and start at the beginning, and hopefully by the time we get to the end, it'll be done.
So incorporating the complaint process
The complaint-
as opposed to separating it out now?
When we get to it.
Yep,
Is
sure.
that okay?
That's okay. Is
So do we-
everybody, that changes the agenda.
Yeah,
Do we-
so we're gonna make a move to change the agenda. We're gonna do final document disapproval. Well, I guess by the time we get to the end, we probably will approve it, I'm assuming.
So I move we change the agenda to make the next item review and approval of the complete document.
Okay.
I second, in case we need a second. Okay, so then we're gonna move on to final document approval, and Jonah had sent that out for us to review. And I'll let this subcommittee take over.
So the yellow stuff, I'll just speak my piece, and everybody else speak theirs. The yellow stuff are the things that we had proposed changing. So the unyellow stuff, black print on white print, white page is exactly what we had before. And that, at the end of that first section, after we met, I was reading through some of the stuff from the IICP report. And one of the other things that I wondered if we might add was, and officer discretion, especially with persons filing complaints.
Do you mind what page are you on?
Yeah, I'm right where, I'm on that first page.
You're on the first page still?
It's the
Okay.
bottom of the yellow print. I was thinking of adding that because.
Adding, I'm sorry, adding.
And this is a list of particularly important trainings that we want people to have.
Okay.
And the IICP report said discretion training is real, officer discretion training is really important. And I'm thinking particularly, and Brian, you may want to correct me, so I'm warning you to be ready to correct me. But we had an incident in Bennington where there was a lot of, that generated a lot of mistrust in the police because the person who was had made the complaint had a lot of charges brought against him. And it just seems like officer discretion training would help an officer. I mean, you could give me a number of citations every day driving, I'm sure, and legitimately, unfortunately. And fortunately, for me, I haven't gotten it. But it does, the appearance of punitive actions by the police on somebody who brings a complaint is something that I think is just an element that probably would be a part of officer discretion training, but I don't know that it would, and so more educated people than I can now speak.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jonah, where he's suggesting that you add that is in that one that's highlighted in yellow that says by identifying and recommending training with particular focus to, and then it gives the list. He was suggesting that, yeah, discretion be added to that list.
Officer discretion.
Yeah, there we go, or something like that.
Yep. Brian, you got any thoughts about that?
Well, this is not a well-considered thought. I guess the only thing I would say is that, the specific incident from what you said
Yeah.
may or may not be connected to discretion. I think that it's a pillar of policing that officers do have discretion for one of the reasons you just mentioned. So I think it's an important thing that needs to happen. I don't know how much it's done as a separate piece of training as much as it's done often in field training. That's not my particular area of expertise. In a sense, what I heard you say has more to do with retaliation, because
Yes.
it sounds like you're saying that at least the perception was that an individual, there were charges brought against that person because the person made a complaint, whether that's the case or not. So
Yes.
I think, that would get to sort of a policy issue, but the perception is more challenging.
Yes.
So, and I think that's a good idea. I don't know if it would actually necessarily address the specific situation you mentioned,
Yeah.
but it's a fun thing to have in there, I'd say.
Is there an anti-retaliation policy already in our Farrington Police Department?
Yeah, we have a segment in our document that we'll get
Yeah.
to about retaliation.
Okay, so that's always good to know too.
I think that probably the best place to address this more is a procedure of once a complaint has been filed, the proverbial whistleblower protection type situation. Maybe within that, and maybe a policy should be that supervisors are required to get involved when those type of things pop up. Just because the guy filed a complaint doesn't mean he has free license to speed, flaunt whatever ordinance that the officer's trying to enforce. But it has to be a procedural / policy thing about once an individual has filed a complaint like this, that any citation have to have involved a supervisor involved.
Okay, I think Brian.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would say is, especially, without thinking about sort of talking to other people, I would be hesitant to put something in that specific, only because there's so many different situations where someone might make a complaint, and often I've seen situations where people make complaints in the midst of other things. There are criminal charges, and then there's a complaint, and it doesn't say that the complaint is valid or invalid, but it often gets complicated.
Yeah.
So then if you're adding a requirement that there's a certain procedure about how, a citation might be issued or an arrest would have to happen, it could get very complicated very quickly.
Right. I understand that, but then, these small town, jungle telegraph, this happened to me. As this committee we're proposing, I think it's imperative that they also have clear lines of communication. So-and-so was called to intervene, assess the situation, and said the validity of the citation was there. Just because somebody filed a complaint of rent and license, misbehaved, but also going back to what we discussed earlier, communicating with the community and instilling and building a sense of trust in the police department. The complaint was alleged, the complainant was subsequently stopped for whatever. Internally, the line of supervision stepped in and looked at the situation and took action. I think that smooths it as opposed to just the officer wrote a ticket and left it at that. I think it just leads too much of it.
I guess,
Inflammatory element in the communications or community input with the police activities. I realize we can't have hard and fast rules about everything, especially when we talk about officer discretion. But I think the idea of someone is alleging or concerned about retaliation, I think there has to be some sort of mechanism within the PD or within this board we're proposing where those issues are addressed. Someone say, so-and-so was cited subsequent to this. And the board can look into it and say, oh yeah, there's a camera of this guy doing whatever, it's a shot, objective finding. It's not a retaliatory stop or a retaliatory citation, but it is very important. It has to be a policy or a procedure in place to in fact respond to those allegations.
So I think it's really important what you're saying, and a lot of what you're talking about sits inside the complaint process.
Right.
So,
Also the anti-retaliatory.
and some there too, so I'm just sort of wondering if we might be able to move on, not forgetting what you said.
Yeah.
I do have one thing in this section though, and maybe someone may know better than I do, when it says substance misuse disorder. I thought the more, and I could be wrong, I looked it up and I see both instances. I've always heard of it as a substance use disorder.
I have to.
And then on page 5, we refer to it again as a substance use disorder, not substance misuse.
Somebody said misuse was the right word though at our last meeting, and I'm not sure, who was that?
It's my understanding that misuse is
Yeah, and like I said, I looked on the internet, like CDC and all the and it's used, both of them are used interchangeably.
Okay,
Yeah.
we
But-
should be consistent though.
Yeah, but on 5, I was just thinking, which either one we decide to go with, just make sure we adjust it on page 5, it's substance use disorder.
So we're going to have misuse on page 5, we need to correct.
Yeah.
So we want it to be use or misuse?
misuse.
Misuse.
Are we keeping the improving officer discretion training? Are we keeping that wording, or did we decide not to?
And if I could jump just one thing in here on this, listening to Clark, I would say, okay, because everything that we've got up to that point, focus on rectifying biases, trauma informed decision making, take it to misuse disorder awareness with the goal of improving officer discretion, because I don't know how you can train discretion. That's a supervisory, it is, but it's a supervisory role.
Very
that comes
subjective.
with- Yeah,
Yep.
you know.
At least my understanding is that there is training for officer discretion. And that's what the IACP was recommending, that be an intentional part of our setup. So that's why I put it that way. But improving officer, I didn't intend improving, just officer discretion training would be one of those things that we would hope that would be part of the training.
I think that's part of the development of a police officer. And that comes from the field supervision. That's how it's going to go out with a training officer when you go through the academy, you go out with a training officer. You're continually monitored by your sergeants and your lieutenants while you're on the job. I think that we're piling a lot in there to where it's balanced more, hey, we've got to watch the police as opposed to let's form a community. We're already covering quite a lot there, and then we're talking, oh, by the way, we want you to work on your discretion also. It's just prickling with me for some reason. It feels like we're piling on the police as opposed to wanting to be community partners.
Do you
We
think
need
that
you
would,
to train in all this stuff. We don't want you to develop on the job.
do you think that'd fall into the category of recommending and evaluating trainings?
I would be much more comfortable with it there.
Putting it there rather than up here?
Yeah.
Brian has a
I'll
thought
just,
too.
I mean, not that I'm a genius, I just went to the report, and one of many references says, developing policy and training centered around officer discretion in traffic stops, as well as periodic review of the efficacy of the policy and training, will assist the department in continuing to mitigate the risk of racial disparity in traffic stops. And there's more about that in that section, but it sounded as though that the focus of that may have been around traffic stops, which is often where discussions of discretion occur. So it might be in the context of other training around traffic stops and that sort of thing, traffic enforcement.
Where might that be in our document?
Well, definitely not under collaboration with candidates, you know.
We don't get into the weeds about traffic stops particularly.
So on page 6, there's a section on ongoing training. Would that be a place that might fit in?
I think it would fall better there, I honestly do. And like I say, that is definitely because it is an ongoing, you're going to be working with that your whole career. And I don't care what field you're in.
Sure.
You know.
We do have a section on training on page 2 as well too.
Now, I'm not opposed to it at all.
Okay.
I just don't feel that's the place.
Yeah. So we're looking at page 2 as an option, Jim, and page 6 is the other one, ongoing training.
I like better than ongoing,
Okay.
because that's, like I said, that's something that's going to develop your whole career. Hopefully.
Jonah, can we go back to the very beginning? Can you take out at the end of, under rebuilding sustaining trust, at the end there's and, comma, can you take those out? And in the other paragraphs too, I think there should only be an and, comma, at the second to the last one. Like take all those
Leaving the
ands.
comma?
Leave the comma, but ditch the ands, yeah.
I do apologize, April, I know you want to move this on a little bit, but I just,
No,
you know.
we're actually doing really good on time, and I don't want to jinx us if I have wood, but you know.
So on page 6, just to wrap this up if we might, at the bottom of ongoing training, there's training in other areas recommended by the board, or chief of police, or other regulatory community aid organizations or legislative agencies, including, we talked about discretionary officer discretion.
I'm sorry, where are we?
Actually, page
Ongoing
6,
trainings at
that
the bottom of
ongoing
that
training
paragraph.
goes more for,
We just added
the
including officer
board members.
discretion.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So
so
it's
you're
on
on
page 2 then.
page 2.
No?
Okay.
Okay, page 2.
So where are you thinking on page 2?
There's a big thing about
Training.
somewhere in that training. It could go in B where it gets into specific areas.
I like B, training B, talks about Rule 13 and then uplifts fear and partial policing, communication skills, and then you could do a comma.
Officer discretion.
Nice.
There we go.
Yeah.
I like that.
Okay.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you. So the next section in pink, any questions about any pink, like yellow or orange or?
See, my mask is reeling you in.
I see Jim's pink mask and all I see is pink.
Well, should we be changing the name as we move through this document?
Mm-hmm. Instead of the oversight board.
Jonah can catch all that later, he's pretty good at that.
Yes, he is great at that.
So I did get some input from Ben. He apologizes for not being here, and it's kind of exciting. He is being trained at the police academy to be a police trainer.
Oh, that's great
He
news.
needs to get to Pittsburgh, which is where he is. He's not leaving our force, but he'll be, our police department is one of the agencies that helps to provide training for new officers. And so I think it's pretty exciting that he's been selected to play that role. So one of the things he brought to our attention was, it says provide monitoring of compliance with Rule 13. And he wanted us to know that, that it is already, this compliance is already monitored by the Criminal Justice Council, which can pull an officer certification if they don't keep their training up on Rule 13. So he wondered if we needed to make it part of our particular work when it's all covered or not. He was recommending that we just drop monitor compliance at Rule 13.
I thought there was
It's
a comment, no, the comment that says, basically being in accordance with legislative policy, rules already, so that might be redundant to have that.
That's what he was
statement about
suggesting.
policy. We go along with the previous topic, following legislative and regulatory policies as outlined. I can't remember where I saw that, but the original will address that. So, I don't think that's redundant.
So could you roll that up so we can see it as section B under training? Below.
Section B under training?
There you go. Provide monitoring of compliance with Rule 13 and to review specifically.
I like leading the board to Rule 13 because it contains so many pieces of what we've discussed. But we could say perhaps provide review of Rule 13 specifically in the areas of, so it would be just like general. They're aware that it is required by law, and that the board particularly would look at the training related to de-escalation, et cetera, et cetera.
We could say to review specifically the areas of, all the rest of that line, in accordance with Rule 13.
That'll take from there.
And then that Rule 13 stays in there.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's good.
So we delete to provide monitoring of compliance with Rule 13 and.
Right. Oh, yeah, all the way up to
That's nice.
review.
All right.
Those two questions? I have a comment. Would you be wanting to change the use of the term oversight board?
Yeah, that's what Jonah's gonna work on, changing all that for us.
Yeah, it's got multiple names that we've thrown.
Yeah, we do, we have lots of different things in there,
Names and
so.
boards and-
Yeah.
And look, we have a great acronym too now.
So the end of the meeting, no one will remember. what-
That's right.
No, that's right.
I will.
So on 2B, it says complaint other than directly to the BPD. And if I understand this, we're not.
Where are you?
I'm sorry,
Oh,
where did we
that
go?
next.
Complaints, excuse me.
Complaints?
Yeah, 2 complaints B. And it says assure a way for all citizens to have a method of lodging a complaint other than directly through the BPD. So we're not, it's a little ambiguous in there to me, because I was going to suggest in addition to directly through the BPD, because we want to make options for people, but we certainly, I don't think we're trying to tell people they can't make complaints directly through the BPD.
All right, great, so in addition to, as opposed to other than, that makes sense.
So as we're looking through this, as we, if we could just read through this and decide if we want to piece it together with the formal complaint process, not the formal one yet, but we have a long 4-page one too.
We talked about this in our subcommittee. What is the purpose of the complaint document, right? Is it to suggest changes to what the BPD's interim complaint policy is?
No.
Is it to replace it?
No,
No.
I can't.
Is it to layer on top? Because there are some sort of detail-y things in there about process. So I think we do need to be clear in coming up with all of this. What's the ask? The ask is that we want BPD to adopt these processes into No.
No.
What do we want?
No, the BPD already has their process,
Right?
and that's already, is state law. That how they have to do, well, it's state law that they have to do an internal investigation, and then they have their internal investigation thing.
Right.
The review process would kick in after the police went through their process. So we're not asking the police to change anything right now about how they do their internal investigations when complaint is received. The whole complaint process in here pretty much kicks in after the police have done their thing.
Because even though we can, there's no law that says we can't do them together, reviews together, it's too messy and it gets in too much into the weeds. So,
Right. The
yeah.
problem, it was explained to me, I think Brian, you discussed this with me too. I don't know where it is. What the problem is, if you have the review board reviewing the case at the same time the police are investigating it, there could be questions of like witness tampering and who talked to who when.
Right.
And where are these records coming from?
But when we get to a point where we're asking for concrete turnaround times, right? To say, getting back to someone, what does that mean? Like, sometime? When?
Yeah, and there-
Could we set, right? And so we do have some things in there, but like, we'd like to have some set expectations, so everybody knows the rules, like, you'll hear back in 14 days, even if it's under investigation, but we received it, right? So people know that it's like on someone's desk. So, but that's a process point, right? That's us saying, we want you to change and commit to, so I'm just pointing out that there are a couple of asks in there
Right.
that do change, I mean, not huge, but like, they're finite points, and we would ask that they be embedded in the existing policy.
That's right. And I think it's also, in my mind anyway, the changes we're particularly interested in are at the gathering of complaint end, not at the internal investigation process.
Correct.
We're really not asking the police to change the way they do internal investigation.
Right.
But we are suggesting ways that the collecting and reporting on that process be done.
Mhm.
And so does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that the collection of the formal complaints have a different avenue other than reporting directly to BPD.
Mhm.
Yes, that there be other alternatives.
Yeah.
Correct.
Not that they can't use that, but yes.
I think it's important to differentiate maybe in the document between formal and informal.
We're going to do that. You'll see that as we go along through here.
Yeah.
There is another section E under 2. One of the things that we keep talking about is complaint and compliment, and and we don't need 17 forms or 4 forms. So what I was suggesting is thinking of replacing E with these 2 sentences, and see what this sounds to you. Feedback, formal or informal, complaint or compliment forms and processes will support multiple learning styles. Forms and assistance in completing them will be available through the BPD, the Town Communications Coordinator, and representatives of a variety of community groups who will receive training from the board about assisting with the process.
I'm okay with all of that except the piece about when it says formal and informal.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think here again, we have to be really, really careful to keep those 2 processes separate so that everyone understands that those 2 processes are very different things with very different expectations and outcomes are.
Mm-hmm. And I think the main difference, as we talked, was the internal investigation. That people like making an informal complaint will not necessarily get an internal investigation. Now they might, and they might be dissatisfied with the informal complaint, and therefore ask the board to ask for an internal investigation. Or the police themselves could choose to do an internal investigation based on an informal complaint because they weren't happy with the way their own system was working. But the basic difference, if I understand it correctly, between the formal complaint and the informal one is that one necessarily activates an internal investigation, the other one doesn't necessarily.
Correct.
However, what I was thinking was we could have one form, and I think this is what we've talked about later, it's you either check formal or informal at the top of it, and it's either a compliment or a complaint, so you don't have 4 different forms. You have a feedback form, and then the person filling out the form says this is either an informal complaint or a compliment or a formal one. Is that, how are you thinking about that?
I think when you get into the thing that we're getting into is that most informal complaints
Yes.
are not done in writing. That's that's part of what makes them informal.
Like if someone just calls
Yeah.
on the phone.
Yeah.
And then
That's-
Brian had a thought too.
Good, okay.
Well, that was part of what I was going to say, is when I saw the idea of having an informal complaint form, I mean, it almost sounds contradictory. And so I think the other piece, so I think people are on board with that. The other thing I would just say is, again, thinking about unintended consequences, being careful about a process where someone can file an informal complaint and then they decide later that they want it to be formal because they bring it to the, I don't quite know how that would happen. I think if someone submits in something informal, I mean, that wouldn't stop them from filing a formal complaint. I think, so but I think I would probably avoid something where it's almost like a process so you can escalate officially from informal and then bring it to the board and then turn it into formal.
And Clark has that thought too.
What I think the person missed is expectation. I mean, that's a critical element here. Am I calling to yell at the chief of police because of whatever, or am I calling to say, chief of police, I see a systems problem that I want to address versus I'm just blowing off steam? And I'm looking at, maybe I missed it, in the process. What are the expectations of the complaint? I mean, that's a critical question too. If somebody's just blowing off steam, fine. Spoken your piece, thank you very much. Versus I expect an injustice or mistreatment to be addressed.
One of the things that we were talking about was to make clearer to the community what the difference between an informal and a formal complaint is, so that if somebody really feels like, no, this has to be addressed, they will be directed to make a formal complaint. Where if somebody's like, hey, I just want to kind of casually call this to your attention, then that would kind of be the more informal complaint and wouldn't kick off that whole process.
I'm in a position over, I'm in media statement, what do you expect, what would you like us to do to address your concerns? If someone's just saying, I just need to blow off emotion, that's fine. We've given you an opportunity to vent, thank you very much. Versus, there's an issue here and I'd like it addressed.
I would hope that the police answering, in my perspective, would say, do you want to make a formal complaint? Because I know when we did the surveys, a couple of people I spoke to thought they did a formal complaint, and I asked them, I said, did you write it down or do something right? And they said no. And they never got any feedback, but they thought they did a formal complaint. So I would hope our police department would say, do you want to make a formal complaint?
Right?
And this is different.
Yeah.
Correct, yes.
So that's part of the process that we certainly are hoping to, whatever process we've tried to draft in here is trying to encourage all people who are, like if it's the communication coordinator or the dispatcher or the person from pay who's helping somebody fill out the form, to be clear about that from the beginning, what the intended results are, what are the likely consequences of this, so that it's really clear to them. The other facet in here is, and it's a significant question, I think, how does the board keep track of the much larger volume of informal complaints so that the board can have a feel for what are the concerns of the community, what are the problems that people are facing? Because obviously, 2 incompleted formal complaints in this past year not going to give the board much of a feel of what the normal daily kinds of concerns are that need to be addressed. So that's why this filing an informal and a formal report and following through with them seems like it may be a necessary evil.
Marge, could you repeat more slowly that? I only got the first part of it, and I was not able to type
When
seriously.
I bring this over to you, and I don't, then you can.
In the meantime, Brian had a thought.
Yeah.
And then Gail.
So, I feel like it's a little bit at the 11th hour, because I know this discussion has gone for at least a couple of meetings, but the more I listen to this, the more I think that part of the challenge is trying to have an official delineated process for informal complaints that is tracked. And it may be something that's much more simple, and it's asking that, there's a sort of, these things are tracked, the number of inquiries and concerns, as opposed to a detailed form or listing of them, just because the more I listen to this, the harder it's going to be to have this kind of parallel thing.
Yeah.
Because in a sense, the informal complaints are still sounding kind of formal. And the other piece related to that is that you know, someone may think that they're just calling to complain, they're upset, and as people have mentioned, the police department may say, well, that sounds like a violation of policy, we need to investigate it. And I think you want to be careful about expectations, because I think about one of the conversations that's coming up a lot in police reform conversations, and is that, what do we do if someone calls 911 and they say, I have a concern about someone on the street, they look like they're in distress. Okay, we'll send a police officer. No, don't send a police officer, or don't send a mandated reporter to my house because I don't want someone to have to report. And I think that you want to be careful about getting into situations where you're giving an individual the power to kind of determine that there can't be an official response. I mean, that can happen, but so it's really about those expectations. So I'm going off on a tangent, but I just think that as much as you want to be able to gather information and be clear with people that they need to make a formal complaint, you also want to be careful about kind of giving people the expectation that they can make an informal complaint and no action will happen. I haven't heard that specifically, but I think that can be what people start thinking. It's like, oh, I want to register this, but I don't want them to do anything because it could get someone in trouble, it could get me in trouble, it could get the officer in trouble. So.
Well, it's interesting to bring this up because the Interfaith Council had a situation where an elder had asked the police to come, and they'd actually come, but they failed to contact the elder to tell her they were there or to give her any feedback from what happened. And she was madder than a hatter and frightened because she felt endangered, felt like there was no answer. So it took us a while to sort through this. And part of what the initial response, Cam's initial response was, sometimes we don't call back to the person who has made a complaint or made a call for service because they're afraid that family members will beat them up or, et cetera. And so, but yet at the same time, they concluded when somebody calls and asks for feedback, asks for a response, the officer needs to contact that person and let them know, I've been here and, where are we? So that's part of this confusion.
And Gail had a comment too.
Yeah, I think putting an informal complaint on the same report as a formal complaint really is going to blur the goal. I do think that we could recommend that people taking complaints have an intake tracking tool where I call up, I make this complaint, and I say, I think that policeman was really rude to me, and I'm old and I'm sick of it. And then the person should be, I want to be heard. We heard that from our community.
Yes.
So we need to have people say, you sound really upset. We're going to look into this. Would you like us to get back to you? And if it's on a little tracking form, then it could formalize. I think that could be our recommendation to the board, to look into working with the police department to develop a tracking tool for informal complaints that would give us some data as well as make people feel that they're being heard, and would the dispatch or whoever would say, okay, so do you want us to get back to you, or what do you expect to happen, or I'm sorry this happened to you, but
yeah, I think
that's what I think we could do separate from this formal complaint.
It's also a really good solution, since we're saying most of these are verbal, right? So if there's a tracking form at the police or wherever that's available to at least capture some of the information that the permanent committee is going to be wanting to
Let's
see.
take it down to near the very end, where we talked about informal feedback. If we could, let's revisit that.
Yep.
So let's read this again, this section E, and see if that makes sense to us at this point. I don't think it requires this tracking form or this complaint form. It could be different forms. I don't know if this allows us the space to do what we just talked about or not, so let's look at it. Feedback, formal or informal, complaint or compliment, forms and processes will support multiple learning styles. Forms and assistance in completing them will be available through the DPD, the Town Communication Coordinator, who I asked, by the way, since he's a friend and I didn't want to have him stop talking to me because I got him more work. And representatives of a variety of community groups will receive training from the board about assisting with the process.
I just have something to put in there about the community groups, because we're volunteering community groups for something that they haven't necessarily agreed
That's right.
to do
They
yet, and,
have to be asked for sure.
yeah, I don't have a solution to that, I'm just putting it out there, that our community groups are great, and they go above and beyond what they're supposed to do most of the time, but they're also understaffed and overtaxed, so, just putting that out there.
I would like to remove receive training from the board because the state is talking about
Okay?
providing that training. So if we could just take out from the board,
Just receive training.
I would like to receive informal
Uh,
forms
From the house.
in the first line. I don't, if it's informal, I don't think we should.
I agree.
Yeah.
So feedback, formal, and delete or informal.
I think it should just say feedback forms, or
We'll deal with
Feedback
informal
forms.
later on.
just take all of it out, because you've got it under the section of complaints. So I think,
Feedback forms,
keep it,
Or
yeah.
just forms, or, I don't know. complaint
Feedback
processes.
form,
What?
Yeah.
Feedback, is that the same as the complaint form?
How about
I'm
feedback?
sorry.
Can we just go with feedback tracking?
Informal.
With tracking word instead of forms, I think we're getting held up on that. We don't know for sure what that's gonna look like yet.
I think this is the initial one before they do tracking. So like if someone was issuing a formal.
will we say intake?
Well,
This is
I'm
really,
sorry,
this
Joe.
is really, let me talk to you about my intent briefly. This is really to say that when people call up, that there are going to be, what kinds of options there are for them to give us input. Will they, do they have to go to the police department, do they have to go to the county? What are the options for people to give their input? So,
The feedback form is a complaint form,
Yes.
right? So why don't we just call it a complaint form?
yeah, and then leave the informal tracking to go later in the informal section.
Yeah.
Yep. So
You
take
have that
out
right?
feedback,
Yeah,
just say
yeah,
complete.
Yeah, I think it's.
Or we
Yeah.
can do compliment / complaints, so that we're not ditching the whole idea of
That's
compliments.
a good idea.
So just a point, this is under complaint section. Do you think it complicates it by doing complaint
I think the same.
It's
compliments?
the same form.
Okay, so it'd be the same. You don't think it complicates it then?
Some, I've read a bunch of different communities. Some communities have 2 forms, one for complaints and one for compliments, but it's just a lot of paperwork because they're exactly the same form. Well, not exactly, but they almost the same. They don't have,
I think in Bennington, they are the same form.
maybe.
That's what I heard too, that it was the same form. Yeah.
Okay, are we done with E? So let's keep on going down through. Does anybody else have any more on this complaint section?
If you're thinking about doing the data section, I think we can leave it into the back page that we talked about doing the data tracking. But under H, it does say gathering important data and number and nature of complaints while maintaining confidentiality.
I don't,
But there is informal feedback that we talked about adding that data tracker to.
So what are you saying, April?
So let me rephrase that. We were talking about doing a tracker and putting wording in there about doing a tracker of complaints and compliments. And we thought about putting it under informal feedback, but we do have a section under 2 complaints, letter H, gathering and reporting data and number and nature of complaints when maintaining confidentiality. Would we want to work some language about the tracker in there?
I think it goes better in the detailed complaint section, but that's just my thought.
Okay. I was just noticing it there and wanted to throw it out
Stuck
there.
in there, but this is really kind of an overview of complaints in contrast to the detail which we're going to get to in a couple of minutes.
Okay. We can leave it till then. I just happened to notice that, want to throw it out there.
Could have gone in there, yeah. Anything on policies and procedures? On data? Let's get this up on the screen so I don't get too far ahead. So on community relations, do we have any things to add or correct on community relations? Look at us flying. next page. Go on. And there's a new section 6, which is called, which you can read it, as situations arise and evolve, the scope and process, which is just the section we're completing, may be revised by the board. This was particularly, I had a discussion with somebody in town, and one of the town officials about what we were doing, and one of the suggestions, one of the things they mentioned was, we could get this all developed and situations may change, and the board itself may just find, hey, this part doesn't work, and we need to do this, and it seemed like making it explicit that we understand that might be possible. Okay, Ryan's going.
No, I guess one question is, it says, I could see the process, but the scope, wouldn't that be set by the select board, not the board itself? Like, the board couldn't just change its scope unilaterally.
That's probably true.
You could ask.
And then while I'm talking, I had a small thing, I missed it when you were going through on data A. I actually,
Let's make a number, are we set?
Oh, I'm sorry.
This change?
Yes.
This doesn't say anything about the select board yet.
Can we say the process?
You just promise the
All right.
state agency change on
Yeah,
the
he's so
first.
fast.
I mean, any body could recommend, the body itself could recommend changes to the select board. That doesn't need to be something in here, I think. Whereas
You don't
it
think
say
we
it,
need this section?
well, maybe. I mean, you might want to change the process that the board might want to change the process it uses, but I'm just saying it couldn't change its scope unilaterally.
So I took out the word the scope.
So are we all right with this the way it is, or no?
I'm still not, okay, I'm not, what I heard Brian say is that the CPAR cannot revise processes and they could recommend to the select board.
No, he said scope, couldn't revise scope,
Okay.
but could revise process.
Maybe. Maybe.
But the scope is the charge by the select board for the permanent board, right? It's already set.
Well,
So,
but it's also, that's what we were just completing, we're just finishing the scope. So the scope is everything we just did.
Yes, we don't even need that.
We don't need
I
six.
don't know that we need it.
Okay, so you think we just drop it out? Are we in agreement? Drop it out?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, fine, boop, fine.
The intention of that was to make sure that the board had like some kind of escape valve or some kind of way that in case this got too detailed and taken them into a corner, that they would be able to get back out of that corner. But if they can do that anyway, then yeah.
And then, I'm sorry, the other thing I noticed was on page 3 under 4 data A. I didn't actually quite understand A. I mean, I really couldn't quite figure out the grammar of it.
So let's read it. Provide accountability to the DPD in trending fair and impartial policing policies. Trending fair and impartial policing. Policies should include the collection of data, real and or perceived, related to gender, race, ethnicity, religion, economical, educational, mental, or physical status.
Maybe that's supposed to just should be 2 sentences, is that?
Yes.
Okay.
The
So,
quote, there's a period, then policy.
Policies should
Capital
be the
P.
next sentence. Okay.
Capital
See
P.
that?
I'm sorry, I try not to wordsmith, but I
It
couldn't quite
does
figure
read
it out.
as though the board is providing their accountability to the Bennington Police Department.
Yeah.
It's like provide a level of accountability
From the PPD. Accountability.
for, provide accountability from,
Garner accountability.
yeah, it's really weird.
Could somebody try to say that in another way? Just
So
a
does that
completely
mean
different way.
does that mean that the board wants to be provided with that data from BPD?
Seek accountability.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
And then after the quotes is a new sentence? Yeah, policy should include, yeah, we get that.
From,
And the real or perceived should be moved to after related to, so that it reads data related to real or perceived
Oh, okay, that was the
gender,
other
race,
thing
blah,
that
blah,
I didn't
blah.
get.
Because it's not the data that's really perceived, it's the.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good.
Ben had a conversation when we talked about data during traffic stops. And the citation, the forms they use evidently are standard forms for the entire state of Vermont, and they include very specific information. And my question is, how do I know you're a rich Catholic or not? And when I'm looking at things like this, and here, you're calling for people to provide subjective or questionable data that's not in accordance with, state of Vermont standards or statutes. So if we're going to say we expect from them to tell us this gentleman was an affluent, whatever, who's got physical disability, where is that information going to be contained in police reports?
Well, part of what, I'm not really answering, I'm responding to part of what you said. And part of it is, we are not expecting an officer stopping somebody necessarily to be accurate in guessing people's religion. But if, let's say, you have a wrap around your head, they may perceive that you're Muslim, and that may be.
Could be a Sikh.
Well, or Sikh, yeah, okay.
So,
But if they, what this, as I understand it, what this is trying to get is the officer's perception of identity. So that if every person who has a wrap around their head gets a double nasty charge, it begins to show up.
The question is, again, based on what Ben was telling me about the citation form, where is this information compiled? How is it obtained? Because the form that Ben described does not have provisions for gathering any of that information.
And I didn't think that could be changed. I thought they had.
That's right, he said it could be, it's a standard state of Vermont form as to how citations are
You just
written.
can't add things in.
So how can we tell the police officer, we want you to tell us if this gentleman is a college-educated lost, missing his left leg?
Yeah.
I think that's.
And I think that's going to be an operational thing. It's like, to me, we don't know. Maybe this will prove not possible to do, or maybe they'll figure out some way to do it. I don't know. This is into the details of how to, right?
I understand that, but again, we're dealing with Vermont law, fixed data on traffic citations. So if we're now putting this mandate that the BPD provide us with all of this socio-economic, ethnic, physical data on their traffic stops, under what authority or basis do we have to create that workload or burden or reporting on the police officers?
Gail has a thought on that.
I think, data is what you make it to be. It's supposed to be scientific, but it certainly isn't. I wonder if we could change the verbiage to say policy should include the opportunities to collect data. That way you're not saying they must collect it or they can't collect it. I would wonder if the Vermont law, I do not know, restricts what happens at a traffic stop. If it's limited to this is all you can do is, what is it, perceived race? Is that what Ben told us?
Yeah, I think that's the only thing that
So
really
that's
gets
the
you.
only thing you can do. So we could maybe indicate that we'd like them to consider opportunities to collect data in accordance with state law or whatever. And this is just me with my quality improvement line, I think it's really hard to judge why someone who is Pakistani was treated unfairly, percentage-wise, of white English people, speaking people, if you don't know that one Pakistani person was arrested out of however many are stopped. I mean, it's just that's hard for me to wrap my head around, but I get what you're saying. I wonder, I just think whenever they can, we need to be collecting data. If somebody says to you, don't arrest me, I'm a wealthy Roman Catholic. I mean, that's data you could write down. That's not gonna happen. But you know what I mean? I just think when you're talking about fair and impartial policing, how do you measure that?
We don't have any data.
The other piece of this data thing is that in the past, there have been holes in the police data. There have been unanswered questions because the data was not complete.
And I think that happily has been corrected too. And because the most recent collection of data, all of the requirements of racial identification have been fulfilled and have to be fulfilled. Whereas before, they were not all, the race was not identified in about half of the questionable issues. So that's all that.
Again, I still say until the state of Vermont issues a mandate that allows a police officer to stop me and ascertain my socioeconomic status or whether I have a physical or mental disability and whatever, I think that it's a far reach. And the day a police officer says, oh, by the way, are you a good Southern Baptist? That's the day my lawyer and the ACLU and I will have a discussion with Bennington Police Department. Because it's not germane to the cause. And, you know, it's a pet peeve of mine. I'm a big believer in the law, but I'm not a big believer in enforcing feelings and opinions. And now we're asking the police to slide into the realm of big brotherism. I'd be livid if my wife was so forth said, oh yeah, the police want to know if I truly was a very fair-skinned black woman or if I was, in fact, a white woman. What would your, think about it?
This isn't suggesting that the police need to ask people when they pull them over. It's not. The perceived is the kind of the catcher here. It doesn't really matter how, in a situation where somebody's pulled over and you're talking about police discretion, it doesn't matter how the person identifies themselves, because what's actually at question there is how the police officer identifying them impacting the way that they're treated. So what's at question there is, how is the officer identifying them?
How's the officer going to say how large my bank account is?
He might judge that by the kind of car you're driving.
What if you borrowed your neighbor's car? Maybe it's not your car.
Right,
But it's still perceived, I guess.
What we're saying is,
Like, I totally understand what you're saying, and I think I tend to agree more. If I got stopped and someone wanted to know my religion,
No,
this
is
they're
not
not
about
supposed to
asking
ask.
you.
When I did the list,
Because now let's say an officer pulls you over and he sees you're wearing a yarmulke and a necklace with a star on it.
okay.
And he says, well, I'm assuming this person is Jewish. He hasn't asked you if you're Jewish.
We're not asking him to ask.
He's never asked you. We're not.
I can maybe help.
All right.
So thank you, Brian has a comment, we're see if we can help.
I guess, so this is not so much a civilian oversight perspective. Here's what I would say. Thinking about all of the different work individuals around this table have done, imagine if you had to try to do that about every interaction you had with someone that came into your place of work, that you had to note down your perception of their gender, race, ethnicity, religion, economic status, so that you could be checked to make sure, to somehow determine the level of bias that you as an individual and your agency was displaying. I mean, I get the idea, I certainly do, and I think that if we really think about how hard would that be for all of us to do, as separate from whether you would be asking the police department to do that.
On the other hand, if all of us did that with our interactions, maybe we would check ourselves and catch our own biases too.
See, there, again, we're sliding into perceptions. You're assuming that these are values that people have. I strongly object to this collection of data. And I think it's coming up wrong and highly biased, and I would be livid if somebody wanted to know anything other than that I transgressed against traffic law or the very nature of being stopped. Nothing else is germane. That's when we run into problems, when we start dragging things that aren't pertinent to the interaction into the scenario.
So what I'm hearing, but I have unilaterally heard, there was no intention for this to be an ask to the person being stopped.
How
It was
are we gonna
simply,
get that
so the
data?
officer makes notes, doesn't he? So he stops somebody and he makes some notes. Stop, blah, blah, blah. They're gonna make a note about the situation, and within that, it would be great to collect some information. It's not an act, it's perception. And so what I'm hearing Lynn say is, if we are to address the potential, the known potential for there to be bias in police interactions with individuals based on their assumptions about these things, then we can only watch out for that if we are getting data,
Why
right?
are you saying consider data collected during traffic stops, arrest, or documenting formal complaints? Where are you gonna get that data? Come to me and tell me what my religion, what my education.
That's a process
and all that
question,
stuff
but
is.
it's not an intent question. I thought what we were arguing is whether or not it's helpful for this committee to have some information from police reports that is their perception of the interactions, so
I
that
don't
we,
think the police have any business gathering information on anyone's education, their economic status, their physical status,
They're not
their
gonna be-
religion.
They're not gonna be gathered.
I can't say
And
we're
where
not-
do you get
Gail
the
has a
data?
thought,
Where's
too.
the data coming from? If they're not gathering it and they're not asking it, how are you acquiring?
Well, it's
it?
kind of like to me, like race, when they get pulled over, they automatically check one, and they don't ask the person. So it's similar to that, but Gail does have a thought too.
I'm wondering if we could skip down to B and be less specific and suggest that the board monitor BPD's data gathering related to fair and impartial policing. And then whatever the government allows, it allows. We were already speaking to them about fair and impartial policing, and they're already getting Rule 13 education and bias education, and we've suggested bias testing. I wonder if that would make everybody feel okay.
Data gathering, what data?
Well, he's gonna take this section out, so it's monitoring.
The Bennington Police Department does gather data.
That's what I look at, what data are they gathering? I think that's germane. Is
Well,
it
that
some
leaves it
rule?
open to
We're not
whatever
trying to
they're
define
gathering.
that anymore.
Well, I
You
understand, I'm
guys
just
just have
saying,
to take over.
monitor, we're going to monitor the data they're gathering.
Yes.
We need to know what that data is.
Well,
What exactly?
But the thing is, if we push them into a corner by being so specific, and we're requiring something that they can't do, like we want this, this, and this, and it's not something they collect, and we're asking them to do something else that's outside of their realm, or say it's outside of what they're capable of doing, then we're gonna put them into a corner of something they can't fulfill either. So I think what the intent was by leaving it more open, is when the committee or the B-Bar board takes over, they can make more formal recommendations on that, if they see there's a problem.
But again, I thought the form that the police use now, that is the state form. I didn't think that form could be changed.
So that they should share that data with us, whatever they
Yeah.
collect on the state form. Whatever they're collecting should be shared with the board.
Right, right.
How about in accordance with state, federal regulation or laws?
that's fine.
But again, I will go to my grave fighting against that data mining and stratification of questioning of people.
Well, I rushed to your grave, we like.
Well, I'm just saying, there's-
I also just want to be cognizant of time. We only have about half an hour, a little less than half an hour now, to get through this document.
So maybe we should take a vote on that to see if we're going to approve leaving that in there. I mean, there seems to be, do you think?
It was taken out, wasn't it?
We have a new section in letter A.
I like the way that reads now.
Yeah.
That's acceptable, but again,
Yeah,
as long as we've defined what data we're looking at, we're not going on fishing expeditions.
So if we can just move along, are we ready now? This is kind of backtracking. We were almost at the end of,
5 was the last one I have.
yeah,
Oh, sorry,
fine.
page
So now
4,
we're on
end
to
of it.
composition. which we've already done before, but we had a couple of little changes. So let's look under composition, expected attributes. There's the addition of, in the yellow print, the yellow highlighting, and agree to sign the confidentiality contract.
I had a question. I thought it, maybe I'm wrong, but I think Stu mentioned one time that no other board is required to sign a confidentiality contract
That's correct.
for the town.
Then they
So
shouldn't
I'm-
have to either.
What was that?
Then they shouldn't have to either.
That's my thought, is we don't, why would we make anything, why would we hold them to a
Because we have access to police records? That's why. I thought it was important that people really commit to confidentiality, like for real, because we may, or the permanent committee is potentially having, if they're investigating something that didn't seem like it went the way it should, and they're asking and requesting records, they're getting pretty detailed information.
Would the board, the select board also get that information if you were reporting to the select board? Or would they not get that information, do you think? I'm just wondering.
So no one in the town, Stu, has to sign a non-disclosure.
I mean,
You think it's implicit?
the select board members agreed to hold executive session information in confidence. They would sign a contract. You know,
So,
and
I guess,
the work of this board will be a matter of public record.
But the data, the reports that come from the police department will not be a matter of public record, right? I mean, some of the police department's internal investigation details will not be public record, will they? I mean, there's personal
You're right,
information.
you're right. The internal investigation details will not be public.
And that's really, and I think that's part of the concern was that we draw enough attention to that really vulnerable data, and the town's already had problems with.
Exactly. There have been some recent incidences where people's personal information got overshared, I'm sure unintentionally, but I think that
I think it
the
goes along.
inspiration behind this was to be very intentional about confidentiality. If that's out of bounds and it's implicit for everybody else, then it's probably
It's not out of
not.
bounds. It's not out of bounds.
I think it would help to build that trust,
We don't
too.
do that now.
So, just in case this is helpful, this was an issue that came up in my own community a couple of years ago because I asked our city solicitor about this issue, and her recommendation was basically the same thing, that we have other confidential information and there's not an explicit agreement that, I mean, people need to keep it confidential. It needs to be emphasized with people. So, I mean, maybe it's, if people still have questions, I don't know if there's a town attorney, but my sense is that it's something that absolutely has to be done, but that I think there may be other concerns about trying to have a legal agreement that somehow specifies that.
In the social services world, confidentiality contracts are just a matter of course. I mean, and BCIL, and Laura shaking her head, yes, it's that name. I mean, if you can, I don't know why anybody who's going to be on this board would have an issue signing a confidentiality contract.
Do you want to specify that it's around the review of the complaints? Like that is what it would be around. All the other work would be
Public.
open to the public.
That should relate specifically to information, work product not generally accessible to the public. I think that's the critical element. Police officer, the police department presents a completed investigation to this board. They will review it. If there's things in there that the police have cited as potentially problematic that are not available to the public, I think they need to acknowledge those limits. But I've been in healthcare for pushing 50 years, and I've never signed a confidentiality agreement having to take care of people who you recognize from the front page of different yellow rags around the country. No one ever said, oh, please start signing, you won't tell what Joe Bono was here for. It was understood as part of my job that I don't talk about patients.
Well, yeah, that's a healthcare thing.
No,
That's
I'm
another part of
saying,
the
I understand. So I mean, you and I are sitting on a committee that's dealing with close confidential information on individuals.
In the interest of time, I'm not interested in like, digging my heels in on this one. It seemed for the same reasons you just went, I've worked in fundraising and philanthropy and social service, it's very standard, and so it is in financial services, but I think, it's just stating that confidentiality is an expected attribute, and dropping the signing a contract is okay with me.
This is also a very small town and can have very real consequences for people if their information gets out there.
What if we, what we have in here presently is a demonstrated,
Right, just leave it there and drop the contract piece, does that work
I
for?
think what strikes me from this discussion is that, and from looking at this, we have unhighlighted a demonstrated experience maintaining confidentiality. And I think what we've talked about is it might be say and agree to be especially careful with information that is not available to the public, or something of that sort that defines that there are certain pieces of information that deserve our special attention when we're discussing them and carrying them forward without having a contract.
Would you want to put agree to be, instead of agree to be especially careful, or agree to be, what's the word I was looking for? Confidentiality with information not available to the public. So not just especially careful could easily be like, well, I accidentally mentioned to a friend that's really going to keep secrets. Whereas we're saying confidential,
Within, maintain, and agree to maintain.
and confidentiality, yeah, with information not available to the public.
If I may, I think one place you may consider thinking about this is when you're doing training on open meeting law, because people will have to understand what is public and what is not executive session, and I think that could be a place where you very strongly emphasize with people that they have access to information that's not available to the public, they receive it in executive session or whatever the exact details are, but I think that's also a training piece. It's not just sort of, be careful, it is a real requirement. The fact that they might not sign a contract does not mean they're not absolutely legally required to keep information confidential.
So are we all right with this as the way it's written presently?
It actually is included in confidentiality, in training as well. It shows up again.
Okay, so we're going to get there in a minute. So let's look at qualifications, okay, expectations. Seek qualified candidates. Seek awareness. This is all what we voted on before. Promotion, number of members, term limits. Training. Now in training, highlighted is and confidentiality contract.
So we could take that out.
Drop it.
So we'll delete that.
There we go.
Oh, okay. Confidential expectations. Does that
No, that's a
sound
good
okay?
one. I like that.
Okay. Ongoing training, removal, anybody who has questions, fire them. Compensation, community resource. Now, there's a new section here, let's read it.
That thought was already in there, we just made it into a prettier sentence.
So, non-members from the police or other local agencies will not be regular voting participants, will participate in deliberations and decisions, but will be invited as needed. The one thing that we've talked about before is not wanting to have the police department involved in any of the review process. But we also talked about wanting to collaborate actively with the police department, like in encouraging well-being of officers or recruiting new officers. So in that next sentence, I was thinking we might add that we might make a couple of changes. The board may request outside help, and I wondered why we had to have a town staff member ask. We don't need to have that. So through a town staff member, we would just delete.
Yeah, I think we can leave it broad like that.
To address areas of concern or to understand issues and options. And I was going to suggest adding and may initiate collaboration with the BPD and community groups. Because I think we want to have a balance in here of saying we want the door closed when we're doing a review, but we want the door wide open so that we can work together collaboratively in all the other aspects of our life. Is that okay with people?
I like it.
How about that? We made a change without having.
That's
one.
right.
Woo!
Okay, we got 10 minutes.
Okay, so the next section, I'm suggesting a replacement, and you may not like it or you may. I'm suggesting that we replace the first paragraph because it has a whole bunch of questions that aren't defined, and the first two sentences of the next paragraph. And here's what I'd like to suggest. Feedback forms, now we may need to change this in relation to, we may want to change this. Feedback forms and the process for submitting to them will be available from the BPD and town web pages at the BPD. I guess that's the same thing. From the town communications coordinator and trained representatives of community groups. So what we're trying to do here is, I think, to define the various locations or ways that people can initiate a concern. And there's a lot of confusion in the other part. Yes?
Is a feedback form the same as a complaint form?
Yes.
So could
Yes.
we just keep the same?
Yes, yes, I think so.
Verbiage there.
I drafted this before we had that discussion, so.
Thank you.
So,
And I would recommend putting that sentence as the second sentence. So the paragraph starts with, community board will offer basic information on where and how to start the complaint process. And then complaint comment forms will be
Process.
available at the BPD
Okay.
town website, blah, blah, blah.
so we delete the first paragraph, is that okay? With all those questions and rid of those. And we start the section with community board, first sentence, and then replace the second sentence all the way down to any with this. Do you want me to give this to you? I'll read it again.
So, Marsh,
Yes.
I think in reading the BPD's complaint or internal investigation process, they have some guidance in terms of accepting or initiating the complaint process is done at a supervisory level, not just any officer. So if someone who wants to file a complaint, I believe, from reading that, they just refer it up to their shift commander or lieutenant or captain.
Right,
So,
it does. So I don't think this denies that process.
Yeah, none of this would impact
So
where that.
any BPD staff, might be approached, but then
No, yeah.
are trained in assisting the complainant.
So we're replacing that section.
Okay, getting rid of that, all right.
Yes. So the replacement reads like this, if I can read it. Complaint forms and the process for submitting them will be available from BPD and town web pages. Oh, that's why I had it. At the BPD and from the town communications coordinator and trained representatives of community groups. So it makes the whole range of places people can initiate their complaint.
So that sentence in dealing with any BPD staff is no longer
It's
part of this
gone.
conversation, all right?
Yeah.
Although, the reason why any BPD staff was included was because if somebody walks into the police station and says, I want to file a complaint, it's staff that it's probably the dispatcher that they're going to bump into, or whoever's at the front desk. And whoever's at the front desk should then be trained and aware of, okay, how do I take this complaint, who do I give it to, how does it work?
See, that's just it, according to their established policy, they don't take a complaint, they call the shift supervisor, and so there's somebody with a complaint, and that's the end of it.
Right, and that person should know to call.
Should get-
If Brian has a thought, he might be able to
Well,
clarify.
I'm sorry, I feel like every time I say something, it makes the conversation longer, but the way in my community, there's basically, you can make a complaint to us or to the police.
Yes.
And when someone goes to the police, they're informed that they can also make a complaint to the Police Review and Advisory Board. And when someone contacts us, we do tell them they can also make a complaint directly to the police. And that way you don't have to get into trying to get the police to change their policy or having two different ways that they handle complaints.
Yes,
So
really-
maybe it should say the staff are trained in directing the person where to go, or, Because one of
required
the
to comply with the BPD's policy on processing complaints. I mean, if you read their policy, it's pretty straightforward that complaints are received by supervisory personnel.
But we also need to add here the communications coordinator, because the communications coordinator is now the other person that they can make their complaints with. So how would we like to word that?
So we have the communication coordinator in there already, he kind of added this.
In this sentence, any BPD staff who might be approached by someone wishing to file. So what I was suggesting was we add the communications coordinator.
I don't think BPD staff should be directed to go to another agency. I think they should be required to follow their internal policies as established.
Yeah, there's nobody, this is just saying that if somebody calls up Jonah, they can start the process, or if somebody calls up the police, they can start the process.
When you say they, who is they?
If you, let's say you're a person complaining.
The individual can start. All right.
And so you could call up.
I'm thinking it's like they're confusing getting a form and it's initiating the process.
Yes.
It's like they're conflating these things.
Right, right. So I think Brian just had a good point. I think we're confusing 2 points of getting the form. So these people would just get the form to the person asking for a complaint. Initiating it would be on the police departments, once they get the form.
That's right.
Yeah, so I think that might be where the confusion, as Brian pointed out, might
But
be
we're
lying.
saying initiate, the title of the section is initiating the formal
Yes.
complaint, so I think that's where the confusion is. What we're saying is, we want, let's see.
We're just giving them like the form to
It's not,
file.
right, I mean, we are initiating it, but
Mhm.
that's a precursor to the police investigation.
So can we go back to any BPD staff or the communications coordinator who might be approached by someone wishing to file a formal complaint or training? Is that okay?
I don't know if I had that correct on what I have on here.
Okay?
Can we repeat that one more time?
Any BPD, let's see if I can,
You gotta go down to the next page, Jonah, I think.
yeah.
It's like the second
Oh,
line.
yeah. Oh, there we go.
Any BPD staff or the communications coordinator who might be approached. So
Okay,
we're
now I
just
think we're
adding
all.
you in there.
Are trained in directing the complainant.
Yeah, because they're not assisting.
So instead of assisting, directing.
Directing the complainant to assistance in completing the report.
Yeah, that's good. And that might be the supervisor, it might be the town communication coordinator. Okay? And we're gonna throw out the ombudsman at the tail end, at least I would propose that.
Right, yeah,
Because we've now gotten rid of that word.
just, that whole phrase can be taken out, I think.
All right.
So I have a suggestion about the specifics on timeline and what will be reported. I don't know if we want to kick the can down the road, but maybe that's one of the first things that the new board collaborates with the police on is, is building this timeline. So maybe we just put a thing in there about, timeline to be decided or something, I don't know.
I think it's pretty in-depth for us to get into, and to outline it here is gonna really set them into a corner, like, we want 2 weeks, they need to have something, when that might not be feasible, so I agree with that. Would we put that, though, in informal feedback on page 10, or do we wanna put it right into here?
I have a sentence I'd like to suggest, and then you can like it or not. The board will establish a timeline of what will be reported and when it will be provided to each person submitting feedback.
Good.
Is
I like
that
it.
okay?
Yeah.
That sounds like.
Yeah, I thought I needed a little more exercise.
Well, they do need to establish a timeline.
Well, in the statute,
Yeah, what about the
Are
board?
a simple complaint versus a very complex one.
Like James says.
And so what about the board in conjunction with the chief of police? Because, yeah, you know, what it calls on vacation or something.
Or we
Yeah,
come up with an unrealistic proposal.
Yeah.
yeah, the board in conjunction with the BPD will establish a timeline.
You gotta get the tail end on
You know what, though, I think we should take out, to each person submitting, they'll just establish a timeline of what will be reported to who.
Okay,
Because they need to report back to the person who submitted the complaint, but they also need to report
To the committee.
to the select board, and
Right.
yeah, there's multiple
Okay.
reporting in different ways that happens around that.
so replace when it,
And to whom?
the rest of it, delete that and just say to whom.
Yeah.
When I see timeline, what does that mean? Where do you start? If 2 weeks from today, we need to know what.
I think
I
that's,
think the timeline is kind of, again, ambiguous and it's lead for potential confusion. You know, a simple like, he was rude to me versus, you know, he beat my husband.
Could you say schedule?
Isn't
Isn't that what we're asking for, is to create some kind of a loop and a regular system of,
I think there should be some sort of, you know, reporting points.
That's what the timeline is.
But I mean, you know, when I hear timeline, people say, oh, that means in 2 weeks I should hear this, and then 3 weeks I should hear this.
And I think it is reasonable that anybody who calls the police station for any reason, whether it's to blow off steam or because something like massively egregious happened, either one of those situations, I think it's reasonable for the person to expect a call back within.
And whatever that time is, would need to be negotiated between the police chief and the board. Because, you know, so that they can be reasonable. So we're not saying in 30 seconds they've got to get an answer back. And so if I heard this right, it was the board in conjunction with the chief of police will establish a timeline.
Yeah.
Is that right?
yes,
Yeah, because we're not gonna do
So
it.
we're going to add after the board.
the board in conjunction with will establish a timeline.
I just want to warn us, we have about 5 minutes of public comment.
I would say just the BPD, in conjunction with the BPD, of what will be reported,
And to whom?
to whom and when and to whom.
When and to whom?
Reported when and to whom.
To whom and when?
Well, the timeline is the
Well,
when.
Right.
So I've got an operational question, which is, we're going to run out of time.
We are.
And if we're going to meet our deadline, and we've got a whole section on informal feedback, we need to decide now whether we can extend our meeting for another half an hour or an hour, or whether we have to do a special meeting, or what we do, because we're not going to be able to get the rest of this done in 5 minutes. Or 10
No.
minutes.
Can we, Stu, if we want to extend the time tonight, are we able to do that?
I don't think the room is scheduled for anyone else after you vote, so.
Because we gotta look, I was just looking at the timeline. So January 31st, recommendations report sent to chair and vice chair of select board. Is that we'd have to have this complete by then. So we can continue on.
Brian, are you free to stay with us? Or do you have to get out of here now?
Because I love Bennington, I am
You're going to stay here all night anyway, Robert.
So what I'm hearing is extend and just get this done tonight,
I think so.
for as long as we need. Is everybody in favor of that?
So we have to do a vote.
Quorum to stay, right?
I couldn't hear you, Gail.
So we just need a quorum to stay, right?
I mean, you might consider extending it for a certain amount of time as opposed to over.
30 minutes?
Yeah, half an hour.
30 minutes, yeah.
So,
Okay.
do we want to take a couple-minute break just to take care of any personal needs, bathroom runs, and then we'll reconvene? And do we have a vote to extend before I lose anybody?
So moved.
Okay, vote to extend for 30 minutes.
Oh, right.
Right. We're on the complaint
Informal
process.
complaint, we were on the third paragraph or something like that. Initiation of complaint starts the timeline.
Right, and then the timeline thing we changed. And then the next place is in yellow is another timeline.
Yeah, but there's something before that I need to talk about. So initiation of the complaint starts the timeline. The police chief must provide status updates regarding the investigation of the complaint. Okay, now then there's their advocate if they have one. Now, we are not, nowhere in this document have we provided for an advocate.
That was ombudsman, I think at one point, there's different wording for it, so now that we've taken that out, we may take
Delete
that out.
their advocate, right? And then specifics on the timeline, we already talked about timelines. We don't need to do that. Okay. And then police conduct, that yellow one in there, are we gonna delete that because we've already talked about this, right? So that yellow specifics on timeline can be deleted.
I mean, you could probably take out in the parentheses before it, within 14 days, blah, 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 like that whole, yeah. Exactly.
Because it's gonna be figured out.
Because that's gonna be figured out.
Okay? So on the demographics, I'd like to suggest that we change it to read optional demographics of persons submitting feedback or complaint or whatever you want to add. But optional demographics of persons submitting complaints or feedback. Complaints, comments. Okay.
How about demographics you submitted basically when they're germane to the complaint?
I think optional is really important.
Well, I mean, optional, but it's also germane, you know, if you have a South Asian person complaining they're discriminated against, and you don't mention that they're South Asian.
So what would you like to?
I think
Germane.
demographics, or, you know, when germane to the complaint, or the issue, how the issue.
That's good.
So I want to revisit the other part, but I do notice up top, there's also something that says officer involved and advocate, and I mean, do we want to take that out so it's consistent with the wording?
Another advocate.
Yeah, and it also says within 30 days of complaint process.
Yeah, we get rid of the advocate up there, thank you.
Do we want to keep the 30 days, or do we want to leave that, the timeline, to be decided by the,
Yeah, let's just let the
Yeah.
board
Let's leave
decide.
that to be decided. Okay?
Within the time frame determined, the timeline determined, yeah. Gotta close that parentheses. Like there's no,
Get rid of it.
and not get rid of it, just put a
Close parentheses at the
close
end.
parentheses on the other end of it,
Where's the other end?
end of the sentence.
Okay, after report.
Yeah.
Okay. So, are we okay here? Then the internal investigation?
Hey, Joe, is there an E on the end of your name?
G-E-R-M-A-N-E,
And the
without
D,
the I.
the D in demographics doesn't need to be
There you go.
capitalized.
Thank you.
That was the start of a sentence before. Okay. So now on to internal investigations. So the second paragraph, which we will do on the next page, this is a big, I don't have the substitute motion here.
I'm sorry, where are you, Marsh?
page 8,
There is no
the first
time,
bold
right?
section.
It's top of the page.
Oh, okay.
There is no time limit. The community board will exercise appropriate caution in reviewing an incident that is not recent, but will recognize that no matter how old an incident is, it may hold valid lessons for the future. So, we really did not resolve this. Do we want to be inviting no time limit, or do we want to be talking? Do we want to even be talking about time limits?
I say no, we don't want to talk about time limits.
Gail says no, talk about time limits altogether.
Can we take that out?
I don't think we should say that. No. 8 years ago, somebody mistreated me when I was walking by the PD and put some realistic elements on there.
So.
Why don't we leave that to be determined by the board? They're the ones gonna be doing it.
Yeah, I like taking out the time limit, but saying the community board will exercise appropriate caution in reviewing an incident that is, reviewing all incidents, recognizing that even older incidents may hold lessons for the future. Could you say something more broadly like this? I mean, I like the point about that there are lessons and things that have happened. It's not that we don't want to hear them, but they may not trigger any tangible outcome, right? Except for informing the process.
So then maybe you want to, because of the heading, maybe you don't want to use review in that sentence.
Examining others, is that good?
That's good.
You all right? Okay,
I think clear we're not going to revive the process or examine it. You know, this is not an attempt to retrospectively amend or change something. I think that needs to be stated that we're not going to redo this whole process. What's up there? Because the next 5 years, we'll review it. Learning point should be with a retrospective adjustment of what's going on.
do we think we need to change this wording? Clark?
Well, it's fine with looking back as a teaching point, you know, something like case law, you know, in a way that gets a lot of money looking at stuff that happened in the past.
Well, we've been talking about different past incidents and how they're informing our thinking, which is good, but we're not starting a total review of something that happened 2 years ago. In the next paragraph, then,
I'm going to
asks
raise my
us
hand.
to remove the deputy police chief because there is no such thing. The next paragraph.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, when it says publicly available sources, that seems very vague, and I'm just thinking about my own work. Like I tell my board members, don't start Googling, you know, I mean, so I just don't know if there's an investigation in any form, what does it mean to just kind of gather things from publicly available sources? I think that,
I think the publicly available sources was like a reference to being able to make FOIA requests and that kind of thing, less so than like saying that they should go look on the internet.
I feel like that whole first sentence puts the board into the position of investigating again.
It should say reviewing, not investigation, during the course of
Gathers,
its.
it says it gathers information from the complainant. They really wouldn't be talking to the complainant, would they?
and that does say during the course of its investigation.
I would
Makes sense.
believe that completed investigations would be reviewed by this board in using the policies or appropriate laws to see where this review did or did not fall within the purview of those laws. And we're not conducting an investigation, we're reviewing the findings and using public policy or public statement rules to see if the decisions or outcomes were compliant with those standards.
The other thing, the other thing that stands out to me, and part of why I haven't spent a lot of time paying attention to this, is because we know that the state of Vermont is going to be providing us training for all this, so we really don't need to define this in detail when we know they're going to go develop their own process to guide us in the review process.
So Jonah, where it says in that paragraph, the bottommost line, it says the board may during the course of its investigation, if you could change that to review, or review of investigations. I don't know, maybe just say review.
How we get rid of the findings, review the findings, so that should be followed.
I'm sorry I couldn't hear you, Jim.
Review of findings.
Yeah.
Are we okay with that now?
Yep.
Delete that.
Now, the next thing we.
I thought we were going to delete that, I'm sorry, I thought we were going to delete that first sentence, no? Gathers information from the complainant. Maybe that was just.
If they're only do a review of the papers that the police provided them, then they might not have a complete picture of what actually happened. So this allows them to also talk to complainants, third parties, and get a broader view of what actually happened and the impacts.
I thought that they were going to, if they didn't understand it, that they were going to go back to the police department and make suggestions for further investigation or recommendations. I don't see them doing
And again,
that.
all of this, we don't know what the state of Vermont's going to come up with. So I don't know whether we really need to go through all this trying to define this when we're not going to really be directing it.
Brian, did you have a thought too?
Well, I mean, it's just a lot, but I guess what I would say is, I think, my opinion, I'll just say this is my opinion, is that you want to be clear, because I'm hearing different things from different people, about whether the board is reviewing complete investigations, and then you could ask for all the information that the police department used in its investigation to reach its findings, or you could be doing a further investigation and taking what the police did and then calling other people, asking for witnesses, asking for third-party statements, and then that's doing another investigation. That's more than just a review of the investigation. That's doing additional investigation to come up with a determination about whether or not, well, I don't know, whether that police investigation was complete or whether you disagree with the findings, but that's a different sort of thing, and that takes, I think, a lot more specialized skill.
And that's what the state training, is my understanding, that the state is going to be offering a training.
A training on how to investigate complaints of misconduct.
Yes, that's my understanding.
And that the board would be trained as investigators of police misconduct as opposed to reviewers of investigations.
Right. That's my understanding.
We could add there and proceed according to state recommendations, or proceed according to state recommendations, or further recommendations, I don't know. I just think right now we don't have anything in place to train the board members to do an investigation. So I don't think we should have it in there now.
Yeah, I think the review is a little, I think, more appropriate. What's going on is when this complaints board looks at what the police department did, what they found, and if they have concerns or questions with their findings, again, we go back and review the appropriate administrative elements, and to some extent even the legal elements of it all. But the idea of conducting an investigation, I think, I'm more thinking we need trained investigators. And from what I'm understanding about this committee, you kind of have people like this don't think they're going to be trained investigators. They have lives. I think the idea of keep using the word investigation or conduct an investigation, I think is asking a bit much and maybe is a little disingenuous for the whole process, because they're not there to visit. They're there to look at findings and how those findings came about and to render a concurrence or non-concurrence. Of course, non-concurrence would lead to recommendations based on policy or legal standards or whatever. But I think the idea of reinvestigating professional investigators might be a bit of overreach.
So I just want to caution us again, we have 20 minutes,
Oh,
and it's like 2 pages. And we're already extended it, so just thought as we're going through this. So right now, we have the community board may, during the course of its review of findings, request all information related to the complaint. Do we want to keep and proceed according to any future state protocols and procedures? Or do we want to leave it a little bit more open, or, open to, and I don't even know how to say this, but basically, if we do get more training, could we leave that open? Like, if, I don't know how to say that at this point, my brain's kind of had enough, but. And then proceed according to state trainings or procedures. I don't know if that quite sums up my thought either.
Maybe just ditch that, just ditch that whole thing, just
Okay.
leave it right there.
There we go.
And then I
Within the training will help us help the group define how they proceed. I think one of the concerns was that if the police department, for example, and I'm not saying that it would, but if the police department made a decision and the board felt like they really hadn't gotten to the bottom of what was going on, then one of the options that Gail is suggesting is they could say back to the police department, we don't think you got to the bottom of what's going on. You need to go look at this, this, and this, because these are things that are not presently defined in your findings. But I don't need to think that we need to tell all that. I think that's part of how the board can function. I mean, I'm playing the chicken out, get to the goal point process with something that I think the state training will cover. But so can we move on from that? Is that okay, that sentence? So the next sentence.
I think we can just strike that whole paragraph.
I was gonna
We
suggest
kind
that.
of just beat that one to death already.
All right, good. So let's go to a response to review. Anything in there? We have a pink section there for Jim's math, but actually yellow. Is that okay with people?
We just skip a whole, that should the police chief and or town manager feel
Yeah, we just
responsible?
skipped that.
We skip that or we ditch that from the discussion?
skipped
We skipped over it.
Still there.
Okay. Because then, I remember we touched on it briefly with, non-concurrences, board non-concurrences of the police department, digging in their heels, not concurring with other non-concurrence. So I just wondering where that.
That's still left. So moving down to the next yellow print, the community board will work directly with DPD and with the complainant to collaborate on a fair and just conclusion. Now, there are two things that I wanted to quickly lift up for consideration at the end of this paragraph. We were looking at the board may, which now has a name, may offer out-of-the-box modes. And two other things that I wondered if we wanted to include for consideration are apologies and mediation. We've talked briefly about apologies. It doesn't mean that we would necessarily require them, that the board would necessarily require them, but that those two might be other options that are out of the box that could be considered.
Stu, I have a question for you that goes to liability and insurance liability. Would an apology ever be forthcoming except from a town level, not necessarily from a police officer or anything like that?
I don't think there's any clear-cut answer. The whole issue of whether or not the individual apologizes, that's probably not going to happen in a settlement.
Yeah.
Because all that does is open up the door to liability.
But-
But is apologies implying it's from one person? I mean, we're just saying apology, right?
So let me back up to what I'm trying to suggest, is that these just be considered as other out-of-the-box possibilities that may be decided by the board that, that they can investigate that, not investigate that, but it just raises the question for consideration.
We could do apologies, mediation, and restorative circles.
I would suggest mediation, restorative circles. If they make the I have a problem with throwing apologies up there just from an apology to me states that I'm an agency, the town, an individual officer, or myself. I'm saying I have done you a harm. And I don't know if League of City Towns or whatever it is, I don't know if they're going to be like really cool with that word.
Can I just put, it does say resolve, where it comes, included but not limited to. So we didn't put apologies, and they decide to later on, it still opens.
So I have a suggestion, both in the interest of time and being more general. Maybe it's just that says something about the board may consider developing means of alternative dispute resolution, and leave it at that,
That's good.
and not have all the details.
So you're suggesting replacing all those bullets with just that?
Yeah, just with alternative dispute resolution,
Many out-of-the-box modes to resolve complaints.
which is a whole field, right, of many things. That can include mediation, it can include restorative justice.
Are we all okay with that? Okay.
And then then you don't have to worry about listing out all those other things, sessions and,
Yeah.
you know.
Okay, let's move on to data then. There
Like,
was one,
right, we're striking all of that and just putting 2 alternate dispute resolutions?
right.
Yeah. That's my good deed for the day.
Yes, thank you, John. Feel free to speak up if I go rushing off and leave you in the dust. So on your data, there's one new section, or one revised section. Some more than that. I guess I missed some things here. 13 minutes. So above that, we have and other factors.
As we move into this, or sort of 13 minutes. So I see lots of yellow, so.
We can ditch the second yellow that says what is the reporting frequency monthly,
Yeah,
because
it's
they're
a
gonna
timeline.
develop a timeline.
Yep.
Yes, perfect, thank you, Lynn.
So do we need to include other factors? That's the question. The community board will develop a system for classifying complaints received by the community board by the type of misconduct alleged.
And other factors, because.
Yes, we do need to have another
Yeah, we
factor.
do.
That's
This
not
is
counted.
one. Yeah.
Okay, so that's, that question mark is rid of. And the other new thing is similarly, the community board will track compliments and positive informal feedback for the report. Okay.
It kind of follows from the one above it. The community board will issue an annual report about the number of complaints.
Can we just put compliments?
Similarly, they'll issue a report about compliments and positive feedback.
Okay, now we're down to the last section, which may need some time because we've done a lot of thinking about this, and I don't know how this all reads with that.
And we were gonna insert the idea that Gail had about tracking, a tracking form.
Yes, and I think this is right in this informal complaint, so thank you. So, let's, first, this is a lot of ideas jammed together into one big block. So I'd like to suggest we just make some paragraph breaks so that we could just break them out. So yeah, additionally, and another one after informal feedback quite a ways later, about halfway down the thing. So just give us some breaks and that'll be good.
So, in the first sentence, I think we already decided that we're not gonna amend the existing
Right.
complaint form, that we're gonna develop an informal tracking,
An informal tracking.
a system to track informal complaints and capture data. System. Or do we want to say track instead of capture?
Track, I think, yes.
Yeah.
Well, capture informal complaints,
A system to,
capture and track informal complaints, period.
I just say track.
To
A
track
system to
informal
track informal
complaints.
complaints be created. The end.
Okay.
That's what my thought is.
we're taking capture out.
Yeah.
So no more capturing.
Okay.
Track informal complaints. Good.
Be developed.
Okay, so now let's
Be
look,
developed.
move up.
Be developed.
Oh,
the
be
end.
developed.
And then it's 2 track. That, we recommend that a system.
Okay, so now the next one. Additionally, the EPG staff receiving informal feedback, or, yes, will, and I was going to add, as with formal feedback, be trained and practice excellent listening and conflict management skills so that community members know that concerns are being heard and understood, understands their choice of formal and informal feedback, and is informed of what kind of response they can expect.
Meaning that's referring to the timeline again,
Right.
meaning somebody will call you back in 2 weeks or whatever.
And you can expect, because you're filing an informal complaint, you won't have a formal investigation.
Right.
Are we all right with that? Do we have questions about it?
So at the risk of prolonging something, I guess I do have a general question, maybe not for discussion, but just thinking about how, if people are offering informal feedback in a range of ways, what kind of response can be expected? I mean, I think that it's hard to define that there will be a response. I mean, maybe there's a response. I don't know if there's always a response. I mean, maybe it's just, okay, thank you, I mean, do we call back a week later? We want to let you know that I talked to my supervisor and told them your story. I don't know if that's necessary or appropriate, especially at this level. I mean, it might be something the board decides it should do.
I think because a lot of what we've heard is about people feeling like when they give feedback to the police, it goes into a black hole, and they never know what happens. I think knowing what they can expect, can they expect a call back in a week? Or, I think that needs to be in there, because people who call or do a form need to know what the next step is going to be.
I mean, I understand that with forms and formal complaints. I'm having a harder, I'm just thinking about my own job and like how I would inform somebody about what kind of response they would get from the police department about an informal concern or.
I mean, I think it can be as simple as, oh, okay, we'll look into that and call you back in a couple days. That's, okay, they can expect a call back in a couple
Well, but that's what I'm saying. It depends on the nature of what they're saying.
That's right.
Right.
A lot of times I wouldn't have anything to call them back and say.
Right.
Because I'm not finding out something or getting information or
But in
taking
that
an
case,
action.
in that case, you could tell the person you probably won't get a call back on this. So at least the person knows to not expect the call back. It's equally as valid. Just that communication piece, I think, needs to be in
Well,
there.
I think when you clarify to the public the difference between informal and formal, I think a lot of that will be clearer, honestly, because informal, somebody calling to say that, the sirens were too loud at 2 a.m., I'm not gonna give you a call back.
So that's not a complaint about the BPD. And I think it's really important that we be clear in our minds that what we're talking about are complaints about the police department. We're not talking about complaints about the next door neighbor.
Right.
And this is kind of, I'll try to be sure. This is, and I'll can't think of words in a second. I think this is unclear enough or open enough so that what kind of response they'll expect, which may be nothing or something or whatever, it just gives the guidance that when people take an informal complaint, they give people on it some feedback about what kind of response they're going to get, and then leave it up to their discretion of what that's going to be.
Gail has a thought.
I would suggest that we write is informed of what kind of response, or is informed of, what kind of response they can expect based on the complaint, or can expect based on the complainant's expectation, or what kind of response will be provided based on the complainant's expectation. If they've got a good tracking form, hopefully they're going to have a little column that says, what would you like done? So I think for an informal complaint,
That's saying the person complaining gets to decide when
Whether
their
they get-
response time is.
not the time, but what
How?
kind,
I don't
I
think
don't
that's,
want you to call me back.
Yeah,
Because
what
my husband's
kind
going to beat the different one out of
kind
me.
of response.
All right.
I think expectations in all situations in dealing with the police, that's what needs to be addressed. If somebody calls and complains because their sirens are too loud at night. The point of the matter is, you can say to that person, we'll look into it if you want us to call you back, but the truth of the matter is, that's probably not something we can change. And on this tracking form, what are the expectations? This person complained about this, and this informally. And what are their expectations? Do you want us to call you back? That kind of stuff. As I mentioned previously before, there's a lot of people who think the police exist to address hurt feelings instead of enforcing law and ordinances. If somebody calls you up and they're angry because they don't like the way the police did something, but without any specific complaint, and they don't want to make a formal complaint, the answer is, well, thank you for discussing this with us. And that's pretty much it.
Give us a 4-minute warning.
Yeah, so after the word, what are you suggesting, Clark, in relation to this sentence?
Well, I think that with these informal complaints, there has to be some provision that acknowledges expectations, on that form. Put there and say, hey, they expect a call back, they don't want to call back. You know, that's we can have a way to address expectations, document expectations and address those expectations.
So would adding based on the complainant's expectations
Or
provide,
noting,
provide the message that you need to know what their expectations are, right?
But I think then you're getting down a slippery slope. You know, this example of the siren, so this person's expectations might be that they don't set off the sirens
Yeah.
at 2 in the morning.
It's not reasonable, yeah.
You know, what I was thinking this is here is not so much like what actions they can expect from the town, but just when they can expect a call back. Or is somebody gonna call them back at all, or yeah, do they not wanna call back, so no one is gonna, you know, that piece needs to be clear to people, I think, when they're calling, what they're.
I like the way it reads right now.
Mhm.
Is informed of what kind of response they can expect. Sometimes that's a big nothing. Your response is nothing. That's okay, but just tell people. That's all we're saying,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's nothing we can do with the sirens at 2 a.m. in the morning if there's an emergency.
can we march on forward? Are we all right with this now?
I'm good with it.
If it sounds like I'm pushing it. After hearing the feedback, the person will be invited to share demographic information. Now, the next little thing I'm not sure about.
I think we already said that we're gonna have them develop a tracking system.
So we don't need to
So
put
that
that
we
in at all.
don't need to be specific about what
Okay,
kind
so we
of.
delete that after sentence. And then we go down to informal feedback will be similarly recorded or written and submitted to the chief or designate by the BPD and communication director or their designee. Do we need any of that?
No.
Because we have the tracking process, right? The person offering feedback will receive a prompt reply within 7 days from the BPD. Do we want to keep
No,
that?
we don't want to keep any of them.
The BPD will record the nature of the feedback. This is again in the tracking, right?
Yeah.
Whole
Whole
thing
thing
goes
goes
up.
up.
Yeah.
The board will track trends to inform its recommendations.
The board will track trends in informal complaints to
Mhm.
inform its recommendations.
Right, that sounds good.
Informal?
Track trends in informal, after trends. Trends in informal complaints.
To inform its recommendations. If the informal feedback process is not acceptable to a person offering feedback, they may file formal feedback, which will trigger an internal investigation. You like that or not?
I mean, if that stays, it shouldn't that be back up at the top when people are given choices as opposed to at the bottom?
That's a good idea if we're gonna have it.
If you're going to have it.
I think it's important for people to know that they don't lose their opportunity to file a formal complaint if they have an informal discussion, so whereabouts at the top?
Just put it right in there.
Okay, and this process may be revised by the SME board, which has got a new name at any time. I think that process, can we say that or not?
I mean, they can do that anyway, right?
Right, they can.
It doesn't need to be there for them to have
So
that.
would the second paragraph, if the informal feedback, should that be underneath this other spiel about informal or formal feedback? Would that make more sense?
So put that first, is that what you're saying?
Well, additionally, because that goes into the informal versus formal. So would it make more sense to put if the informal feedback after the paragraph and additionally?
I think you're right, after listening to the feedback, be nice to listen to it before you.
Yeah.
And then if you can change in that sentence, if the formal feedback process, they may file a formal complaint,
Yes, thank you.
just to,
Mhm.
yeah, a formal complaint.
And then just leave it at that, right? They, yeah.
Which we always have to trigger on, right?
So that would just formal
Take
complaint
that
would
out.
be the
So
end
which
of the
will
sentence.
trigger, you're gonna take that out.
Complaint period. Yep.
We good?
Exactly 7 o'clock, people.
Now, there's one more sentence that
But wait, there's more.
you ordered. Do we need to ask the BPD to review their general order for internal investigation based on the stuff in this document will happen automatically.
We're not looking for the board
Yes.
So we're talking,
I think
there
you're right.
are things in their detailed process that we've specified in terms of like listening carefully and tracking and things of this sort that aren't in their process.
But I think if the board reviews this and it goes to the police and says that, then that would be their next step to take, would be to say, we'd like you to amend your process to incorporate these things.
So we don't need to put it in here.
I don't think so.
Yeah, Jonah, can we just get the acronym put down instead of SD board,
So the EPAR.
very last sentence? Thank you, sir.
Does this mean what I think it means?
I move to adjourn.
No, not yet. I move that we adopt this document as
Oh,
edited.
that's great.
Is there a second?
Whatever it says.
Can we just ask, just for the heck of it, public comment? There's no one here, but I just want to say that we ask for public comment.
Thank you.
Okay.
So we made a motion that's been seconded. We need to vote on it.
I'm sorry, Marsh made the motion. Who seconded it?
Mark, vote.
I want to say to accept it after Jonah has fixed the formatting. I'm so stuck on the
Yeah, you
formatting.
could say conditionally accepted pending final editing, and then
Right.
Okay, I accept that as a friendly amendment. Will the seconders accept that as a friendly amendment?
Yes.
Except pending final, what did you say?
editing.
Final.
Editing.
Okay.
And our next meeting's on February 10th at 4:30 here, correct?
Yep. That's a run through the presentation.
Right.
We
And
did.
then